between the worlds of Lewis Carroll and the world of Flann O'Brien. I know we've been gossiping a bit before the start of it, so I won't take up any more time and I'll let Paul kick off. And at the end of it, we'll have questions. If you have questions while it's going on, please put them in the chat room and I'll read them out at the end. So without any further ado, Paul, take it away.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I really appreciate it. Can everybody hear my voice? Perfect. Then let's go. So I'd just like to start by offering my sincere thanks to Jane Skelly, to Stephen Folan, to everyone at the Lewis Carroll Society. I'm very honoured and pleased to have been invited to share with you some of my research into Lewis Carroll's influence on the 20th century Irish modernist and satirist Flann O'Brien, and hopefully to introduce you to a great but still often overlooked comic writer in the Carrollian tradition. And I'd like to dedicate this talk to the memory of my friend Tessa. So today's date is doubly appropriate for this occasion, as it marks both the 55th anniversary of Flann O'Brien's death, appropriately giving his taste for hoaxes on April 1st, 1966, and the 145th anniversary of the publication of Carroll's The Hunting of the Snark. I'm sure that many of you bear a certain suspicion, given that the talk is taking place on April Fool's Day, and I'm not going to tell you that such suspicions are entirely unfounded, but I will try to tell the truth, at least for the most part. At the start of Flann O'Brien's debut novel, At Swim Two Birds, the narrator reflects that a good book may have three openings entirely dissimilar and interrelated only in the prescience of the author, or for that matter, 100 times as many endings. In this triadic spirit, my talk today is divided into three parts, although unless things go very much off the rails, I plan to bring it to a single ending. In the first part, I'll explain the theoretical framework of my argument, which foregrounds the influence of Lewis Carroll's renowned play with temporality, by which I mean the progression of past, present, and future on 20th century literature, what I will call here broadly modernist writing, and how Carroll influences modernist writing by exploring the status of eternity in modernity. In the second part, I will introduce Flann O'Brien and suggest why reading his work in tandem with Carroll reveals new aspects of each author's writing. And in the final part, I will share with you some of O'Brien's writing about Carroll from his Irish Times newspaper column and show you some key scenes in his posthumously published masterpiece, The Third Policeman, in which I propose Wonderland time directly influences that novel's comic handling of themes of timelessness and eternity. So this talk is extracted from a chapter I'm writing for Modernism in Wonderland, Legacies of Lewis Carroll, which is a collection of essays forthcoming from Bloomsbury. My sincere thanks to the editors Michelle Whitten and John Morgenstern for their guidance and insight in shaping this work. I'm sure, like me, you're all excited to learn more about that book, about Carroll's influence on modernist writers from Eliot, Joyce, and Woolf to Bowen, Borges, Nabokov, and beyond. So I'm really delighted to be a part player in what I suspect will be a major publication in both Carroll studies and modernist criticism. So in that longer work that I've contributed to this forthcoming book, my interest is in the importance of the idea of timelessness. So by this I mean an eternity without duration or extension, so an eternity of stasis. The importance of this idea of timelessness to a strand of modernist writing, which was turning to certain ideas from the past to explore new ways of representing the increasingly fragmented experience of 20th century life. So examples of what I'm thinking about in modernist writing and its attempt to revive the idea of timelessness in writing about the 20th century are legion, but perhaps the preeminent instance is T.S. Eliot's argument in Tradition and the Individual Talent that the modern poet should acquire a, quote, sense of the timeless as well of the temporal, and of the timeless and of the temporal together. So this idea that the past is both behind us, thus historical and temporal, yet still with us in its continued influence on the present, thus timeless, underpins the characterization of history that T.S. Eliot presents in his poems, The Four Quartets, where he presents history as, quote, a pattern of timeless moments, as well as that poem's declaration that, quote, to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint, or, Eliot implies, for the modernist writer. So this 20th century modernist drive to innovate a form of literary expression that escapes the clock's control over human life is found elsewhere, in Ursula's quest to find a new sense of eternity within the flux of time, in D.H. Lawrence's The Rainbow, or in Kangaroo's declaration that it is only in the great pause between the ceaseless tick-tack of the clock that one finds, quote, the reality of timelessness. Elsewhere, Teresa Prudente demonstrates Virginia Woolf's diverse representations of the modern experience of a subjective, non-linear, internal time, which variously allows characters to enter a timeless temporal dimension, as in Woolf's Orlando to the Lighthouse, and so on. To my mind, the pinnacle of this high modernist literary experimentation with forms of timelessness is to be found in James Joyce's cyclical Finnegan's Wake, or a play like Samuel Beckett's A Waiting for Godot, in which, famously, nothing happens twice. So generally, critics who reflect on this dynamic of time and timelessness in modernist writing point to ancient and medieval sources. You know, they point to Augustine's concept of, quote, the sublimity of an eternity which is always in the present. Or they point to Dante's Divine Comedy, which presents God's timeless eternity and human finitude as two empires divided by their distinct laws of stasis, in the case of, you know, divine eternity on one hand, and duration and change in the case of human time. But what I want to suggest here today is that Lewis Carroll is a key, if often under-acknowledged, influence for a certain strand of this modernist attempt to revive the ideas of timelessness and eternity in the secular age of mass culture, and particularly, I'll argue today, in the enduring legacy of the Mad Tea Party. So Calvin R. Peterson, Tamsin Lorraine, Carolyn Garcia de Souza, and other Carroll scholars have helped us to understand the importance of time to Carroll's art and to his comedy, with Gillian Beer noting that, quote, time haunts both Alice books, as, quote, Carroll saw problems of temporality as fundamental both to logic and to possible worlds. So the debt that modernist writers owe to Wonderland time, as this kind of strange, bizarre time out beyond the clock, is confirmed, for example, by Borges, who argues that it was Carroll who taught modern writers to play with the possibilities of reversible time and delayed time. Similarly, Marshall McLuhan insists that into, quote, the uniform Euclidean world of continuous space and time, Carroll drove a fantasia of discontinuous space and time that anticipated Kafka, Joyce, and Eliot. So the key instances from the Alice novels, I think, are well known. The time-stressed rabbit who leads Alice down the rabbit hole. The effect of living backwards on the White Queen that leads her to plaster her finger, then cry out in pain, then finally to prick it. The king's messenger imprisoned prior to judgment for a crime he is yet to commit. The unicorn advising Alice that the way to divide a looking glass cake is to hand it round first and cut it afterwards. In each case, Wonderland offers modernist writers a model for thinking an impossible time beyond the restrictions of linear, objective, historical clock time. Yet, joining this conversation, I wish to make a more targeted claim that Wonderland's influence on the comic Irish modernist tradition of Joyce and Beckett, and I'm going to argue today, Flann O'Brien, rests upon its comic confusion of the classical and medieval time and timelessness topos. So while we've seen that T.S. Eliot asks us to clearly delineate and to observe the interplay between time and timelessness, for Joyce, Beckett, and for Flann O'Brien, it's rather the banal but comic confusion between these ideas that they learn from Carroll that for them characterizes the 20th century. The 20th century for them is a time in which we can no longer distinguish between time and timelessness. So what does this mean? In other words, what Carroll's play with time offers these writers is not just a reorganization of linear clock time, stopping time, reversing it, and so on, but rather a picture of timelessness, which is nevertheless and at the same time characterized by the modern coordinates and measurements of time's passing. So scenes of timelessness where the clock no longer works, where nevertheless time trickles on, because there's still scenes of production and consumption, conservation, waste, labor, exhaustion, austerity, excess, and all these types of things. So let me give you some more concrete examples of what I mean here. So the comic temporal aporia, like this mystery, this strange impossibility of a productive timelessness, some timelessness where nothing changes, yet everybody is productive and everything is changing all the time anyway, is succinctly captured in Carroll's The Two Clocks. So this short puzzle proves that a clock that doesn't go at all is more accurate than one that loses a minute a day, as the stopped clock will tell the correct time twice a day, whereas the slow clock will tell the correct time only once every 2 years. The counterintuitive solution to Carroll's puzzle provides the opportunity to slip playfully into logical irony. You might go on to ask, Carroll writes, how am I to know when 8 o'clock does come? My clock will not tell me. Be patient. You know that when 8 o'clock comes, your clock is right. Very good. Then your rule is this: keep your eyes fixed on your clock, and the very moment it is right, it will be 8 o'clock. But you say, there, that'll do. The more you argue, the further you'll get from the point, so it will be just as well to stop. So the wry implication here that a stopped time will be more industrious than a mechanical regulation of time through the clock, which ultimately, defeats its primary purpose, is turned to good account in the comic confusions of time and timelessness that we see staged at the Mad Tea Party in Wonderland. So as we know, at the Tea Party, it's always 6 o'clock, yet the Hatter's watch is 2 days wrong. I mean, how can these both be true at the same time? So what a funny watch, Alice remarked. It tells the day of the month and doesn't tell what o'clock it is. Why should it? Muttered the Hatter. Does your watch tell you what year it is? Of course not, Alice replied very readily, but that's because it stays the same time for such a long time together, which is just the case with mine, said the Hatter. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. So as Beer underlines, this scene depicts a very strange version of timeless duration, as the participants at the tea party can continue their own lives and conversations within the arrested time. However, this stopped timelessness of Wonderland is shot through, almost paradoxically, with incompatible temporal coordinates of time's passage. We read further. Now, if you only keep on good terms with time, you do almost anything you like with the clock. For instance, suppose it were 9 o'clock in the morning, just time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint to time and round goes the clock in a twinkling. 1:30, time for dinner. That would be grand, certainly, Alice said thoughtfully. But then I shouldn't be hungry for it, Not at first, perhaps, said the Hatter, but you could keep it to 1:30 as long as you liked. Is that the reason so many tea things are put out here? She asked. Yes, that's it. It's always tea time and we've no time to wash the things between the whiles. Then you keep moving around, I suppose, said Alice. Exactly so, as the things get used up. But what happens when you come to the beginning again? Alice ventured to ask. Suppose we change the subject, the March Hare interrupted. I'm getting tired of this. So in part, the scene's comedy is produced by how it establishes a timeless stasis. It's always 6 o'clock at the tea party, which nevertheless is characterized contradictorily, even impossibly, through chaotic processes of change and duration, eating and drinking, excess and want, production and consumption, energy and exhaustion, conservation and waste, and so on and so forth. These are things we don't see in eternity. They're in the stasis of the divine timelessness of God's eternity. So this is such a vision of timelessness where, absurdly, things get used up. And it's one in which results in both endless labor, so it's timeless and they have to keep working all the time, and at the same time, there's no time for productivity between the whiles. So my claim is that it's specifically this aspect of Carroll's way of representing time and timelessness in his Alice books that make them uniquely suited to the concerns of 20th century writers who are trying to come to terms with the experience of living in Hamlet's well-worn phrase, a time out of joint, you know, living in a mass culture of increased mechanization, industrialization, war, alienation, fragmentation, all the themes we know from modernist writing. A time of both excess productivity and of austerity, amid a zeitgeist of seemingly exponential change and profound stasis. You know, we don't have to wonder that the rallying cry of modernism perhaps is to make it new, to take something from the past to make it new, and so on. The past is both in time and timeless in Eliot's formulation. So although he's a relatively late modernist, Flann O'Brien is highly representative of these themes, writing in a modernizing Ireland at the outset of the emergency of the Second World War. So who was Flann O'Brien? So here we go, part 2, on not being Flann O'Brien. So this is Flann O'Brien. Already, there are two things wrong with this claim. First, Flann O'Brien is not Flann O'Brien, but rather one of the many pen names of Irish author Brian O'Nolan. So O'Nolan was born in Strabane in County Tyrone, Ireland in 1911 and raised in an Irish-speaking family. As a student at University College Dublin, he became notorious in the Dublin literary scene for his anarchic, absurd, satirical writings for a variety of journals and magazines, including Blather, which he co-founded. Like Dodgson, O'Nolan lived something of a literary and professional double life, given his day job in the Irish civil service, serving as private secretary to a number of ministers for local government and public health. Perhaps this is a reason, in part, that O'Nolan never published under his own name, leaving behind a wealth of comic newspaper columns, short stories, stage plays, TV sitcoms, non-fiction, and hoax letters under names such as Count O'Blather, Brother Barnabas, Lear O'Connor, George Nowall, John James Doe, Velvet Texture, Whit Cassidy, Judo Clifford, Hilda Upshot, Juno Ruddy, Sodium Carbonate, Copper Sulfate, and perhaps many more which are still undiscovered. So this slipperiness, writing under all these different names and concealing himself and everything else, has led to a certain degree of uncertainty behind the man himself, as evident in the fact that this is in fact not only not Flann O'Brien, but also not Brian O'Nolan. So this is not an April Fool's gag on my part, but a widely held misconception, given that this photograph is the one on the cover of the Everyman complete novels of Flann O'Brien, as well as all over the internet in articles about Flann O'Brien and so on, despite the fact that this is decidedly not Flann O'Brien and not Brian O'Nolan, but rather his contemporary, Robert Farren. So the International Flann O'Brien Society has put together this helpful guide to avoid further confusion and further fake news and disinformation being spread, right? Not Flann O'Brien, not Flann O'Brien, not Flann O'Brien, could be Flann O'Brien, still looking into that. Flann O'Brien, Brian O'Nolan, this is him. So clearly we're dealing with a rather slippery customer. However, for our purposes today, we're talking about Flann O'Brien, the pseudonym that O'Nolan used for the 3 English language novels he published during his lifetime, At Swim to Birds, The Hard Life, and The Dalkey Archive. And another important name is Miles na Gcapaill, the pseudonym that he used for his Irish language novel An Beabucht, and his bitingly satirical and often absurd Cruiskin Lawn column that ran in the Irish Times from 1940 to 1966. Most importantly, I'll be focusing on O'Brien's masterpiece, The Third Policeman, written in 1939 to 1940 and published posthumously in 1967. So the appropriateness of the Carroll-O'Brien pairing, like putting Lewis Carroll and Flann O'Brien together in these discussions, beyond their shared status as comic and satirical writers who publish under pseudonyms, who live double lives and so on, is demonstrated in the fact that they're often paired in the frame and in titles from O'Brien's studies. So we see this, for example, from Wim Tiggs's 1989 article, Ireland in Wonderland, Flann O'Brien's The Third Policeman as a nonsense novel, up to Carol Taft's 2008 monograph, Ireland Through the Looking Glass, Flann O'Brien, Miles Nagopoly, and Irish Cultural Debate. So in general, the comparison between Carroll and O'Brien focuses on the author's similar humor, their use of nonsense towards satirical ends in the Cruiskin Lawn columns, and also a shared interest in science writing, the philosophy of language, and strange non-human transformations that we see in Wonderland and also characterize the absurd world of the Third Policeman. So indeed, Tiggs emphasizes the, quote, Carrollian logic of the Third Policeman's strange jurisdiction as a place in which time, space, and language change constantly, and the reader is inundated with logical impossibilities, quoting from Tiggs here, such as invisible sharpness, boxes within boxes receding to nullity, inaudible music, and this type of thing. So Tiggs's conclusion in his study, quote, to anyone familiar with the Alice books, the resemblances in technique are striking. So here I want to focus on an aspect that has not really been addressed in these works as good as they are. Namely, how Carroll's comic timing, which we characterized in part 1, influences O'Brien's comic modernist representations of timelessness. So indeed, The Third Policeman points exactly to this source on this theme, given that the Hatter's claim that it's always 6 o'clock in Wonderland is explicitly evoked in the description of the Third Policeman's uncanny world as a place where, quote, it was always 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So let's look at what O'Nolan, O'Brien, Nagopoly et al. Actually wrote about Wonderland to get a better idea about what about Carroll's writing interested him, and his own sense of his debt to Carroll's representations of time and timelessness. So part 3, Flann O'Brien in Wonderland. In a 1954 column titled March Hare, Miles Nagopoly affects to present himself as a serious critic of the works of Lewis Carroll. Miles promises his daily readers an astonishing thesis, quote, on Thursday evening, I was sitting in the library of my house in Santry. Believe me when I aver that I was reading Alice in Wonderland, having also read a biographical preface about Lewis Carroll, otherwise Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. Some hours before, I had been reading the biography of Karl Marx. Several familiar things in Alice had a new impact on me, and I soon discovered that this was due to an extraordinary coincidence of dates, time, and work, as between Marx and Carroll. Alice, like many another work, was written for children but intended for adults. It's saturated with the Hegelian dialectic upon which Marx superimposed his own philosophy of economics and the classes. Alice is a pro-communist parable. I believe I can demonstrate that with exhaustive annotation. However, this promised exhaustive study never arrives. It's interrupted by a loudspeaker announcing what appears to be an air raid over Miles Nagopoly's palatial home in Santry, but which turns out to be an earthquake caused by, quote, violent political tremors, men shaking in their boots, no doubt in anticipation of Miles's paradigm-shifting reading of Alice in Wonderland. And this promised comparative analysis of Carroll and Marx is not taken up again. So if we entertain the idea that Miles means this semi-seriously, and not only as, you know, a groan-worthy play with the name Carroll Marx. I would speculate that the key scene that Miles's Marxist reading would seem to be thinking of is the Mad Tea Party, in which time is personified as a frustrated, overworked labourer. Alice's charge that the Hatter is wasting time is met with the rebuttal. If you knew time as well as I do, you wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him. Alice's declaration, quote, "I know I have to beat time when I learn music," prompts the Hatter to respond. Ah, that accounts for it. He won't stand beating. The Hatter relates that this anthropomorphized time stopped working for him owing to a quarrel in which the Queen of Hearts accused the Hatter of murdering the time when singing. Ever since that, the Hatter tells Alice mournfully, he won't do a thing I ask. So it seems likely to me that Miles notes Carroll's punning rhetoric here of time, not only as an abstraction that can be saved, spent, wasted, and so on, as in the modern idiom, but also as a worker who is beaten, murdered, and generally exhausted. So the comic image that O'Nolan inherits from the Tea Party is of a timeless eternity in which time still works in every, in both senses of the word, yet where his productivity is always potentially interrupted by a labor dispute. This reading is bolstered by a more overt reworking of the Mad Tea Party in Miles's August 7th, 1946 column, in which he reports the time factor's involvement in a strike on the Dublin docks when there was, quote, a lot of extra time being imported for building contracts. So this is the column, in part, quote, do you know what happened? It went bad. So they've imported too much time, that's the premise of this. And they've an excess of time, too much time. Do you know what happened? It went bad, the time went bad, it went off. The merchants, of course, the usual thing, wanted to blame it on the time factor. The time factor washed his hands of the whole thing, said his contract ended at the Dublin Quay, said he'd have to be paid. The merchant said it would have to go to arbitration. The time factor invoked the war clause. Well, to cut a long story's heart, he got his money, but he's done himself a lot of harm with the merchants, thus talking of them sending on one of their own to Greenwich in the future. So Miles's playful punning on, a long story short signals an engagement with the Carrollian tradition of punning and neologisms and so on. However, the allusion to the war clause demonstrates that in the national paper, he engages the mad timelessness of the Tea Party, more specifically to leverage a satirical critique of immediate labour and political conditions. O'Nolan's interest in the comic temporal scheme of the Mad Tea Party as a template for representing both the comic and these darker tensions of the modern moment is most fully explored in The Third Policeman, the novel which was at this time hanging in its own unpublished limbo. So a very short, spoiler-free summary of The Third Policeman. So The Third Policeman tells the story of a nameless narrator and his co-conspirator, John Divney, who murder a man named Mathers to steal his black cash box. When the narrator returns to Mathers' house a few years later to retrieve the black box, he feels something strange pass over him. The box has disappeared, and he finds himself engaged in a conversation with his murder victim. From there, he sets off to the local police barracks to inquire about the return of his black box, where he encounters policeman McCrushkeen and Sergeant Pluck. Working from inside a barracks that appears from the outside to be completely two-dimensional, these bicycle-obsessed policemen introduce the most explicitly Carrollian level of absurdity to the text. McCrushkeen presents the narrator with a series of mind-boggling inventions, such as an apparatus for wrangling sound out of light, a spear so sharp that the point is invisible for the last 7 inches of it, a Russian doll-style series of boxes that go all the way down to the invisible nano-atomic level, and so on and so forth. And it is Sergeant Pluck who informs the narrator of the principle of the atomic theory that is at work in this parish, that's transforming cyclists into their bicycles and vice versa. Clues are laid for the policeman's connection to Wonderland, such as the detail that policeman Fox, quote, is as mad as a hare. So the narrator is driven to the murder that begins the events of the novel, in order to fund the publication of his autodidactic scholarship on the eccentric philosopher Deselby, whose unusual theories are detailed in the book's footnotes. Theories such as that the earth is sausage-shaped, or that sleep is a consequence of light asphyxiation due to an accumulation of black air. Time is a key concern in the work of Deselby, a philosopher who, we're told, quote, would question the most obvious realities and object even to things scientifically demonstrated, as in his assertion that human existence is, quote, a succession of static experiences, each infinitely brief. From this presupposition, which he determines from examining old cinematograph films frame by frame, so he doesn't realize they're to be projected, he watches, patiently looks at every frame on them to watch the film. And from this, Deselby, quote, discounts the reality or truth of any progression or serialism in life. He denies that time can pass as such in the accepted sense, and attributes to hallucinations the commonly experienced sensation of progression, as for instance, in journeying from one place to another, or even the hallucination that we know as living. So the assertion that linear time is an illusion that belies an underlying stasis is manifested throughout the policeman's realm, where it is always 6 o'clock, it's always 5 o'clock in the afternoon rather, and where Sergeant Pluck declares at one point, quote, this is not today, this is yesterday. So to take stock, both Alice in Wonderland and the Third Policeman depict the fallout of a radical event that changes the protagonist's reality. Alice's descent through the rabbit hole, the nameless Deselby scholar's encounter with the mysterious black box. Alice and the Deselby scholar are thus thrust into a timeless realm of stasis, where it's always 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock respectively, that nevertheless is marked by a principle of radical change. Cats turning into smiles, babies transforming into pigs, humans being changed into bicycles, and so on. In each text, the simultaneous functioning of fundamentally incompatible temporalities, time and timelessness, engenders not only comic misunderstandings, but also a range of comic impossibilities. So if time allowed, I would have liked to have brought you through all the different instances in which Wonderland time shows up in O'Brien's parish, but I'll have to invite you to read The Third Policeman for yourselves and to draw your own conclusions, or even to buy Modernism in Wonderland later this year to read the full chapter here, with, of course, apologies for this cheap plug. However, I will close with a scene that ties the conversation between these texts, between Alice in Wonderland and The Third Policeman, back to Miles's partly tongue-in-cheek Marxist reading of the abused time of Carroll's timeless text. So at one point in The Third Policeman, a map of the parish, complete, reliable, and astonishing, is found in the cracks of the ceiling of the police barracks. Sergeant Pluck informs the narrator that it was always there, and McCrushkin is certain that it was there even before that. The map leads the policeman to the discovery, after 7 years of study, that the timeless eternity that they police is the location of an even more timeless eternity, the entrance to which is to be found beside Jarvis's outhouse, and which is accessible by a mechanical lift. So the description of the, so they go to this, they go to this eternity inside of eternity, they go down in the lift and so on. And the description of the nameless protagonist's descent into this subterranean eternity within eternity via this mechanical means is, I'd like to show you, an iteration of Alice's fall down the rabbit hole, but with a difference. So in Alice we read, quote, either the well was very deep or she fell very slowly, for she had plenty of time and she went down to look about her. She had plenty of time as she went down to look about her and to wonder what was going to happen next. Down, 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 would the fall never come to an end, when suddenly, thump, thump, down she came upon a heap of sticks and dry leaves, and the fall was over. So I would have us compare this fall down the rabbit hole with the Deselby scholars' descent into this mechanical eternity inside the parish of the Third Policeman, in which O'Brien inverts the slow fall and sudden landing of Alice's descent. quote, "With no noise or warning at all, the floor was giving way beneath us. The floor was falling so fast beneath us that it seemed once or twice to fall faster than I could fall myself. I swore and groaned and closed my eyes and wished for a happy death, falling appallingly forever. Almost at once the falling changed, either stopped altogether or became a much slower falling. Yes," said the sergeant brightly, "we're there now." So it seems to me that this intertextual echo shows O'Brien's intention both to map this eternity, this lift journey onto Alice's fall down the rabbit hole, and the eternity that he arrives at onto Wonderland itself, but to signpost the accelerated state of affairs which his 20th century fantasy grapples. So they go down into eternity, then in this lift, and the absence of time in the policeman's eternity within eternity is not only demonstrated in the presence there of an 8-day clock that never goes, but is also measured in the stasis of a body which does not grow old. The policeman informed the narrator that down there, quote, "The beard does not grow, and if you are fed, you do not get hungry, and if you are hungry, you don't get hungrier. Your pipe will smoke all day and will still be full, and a glass of whiskey will still be there, no matter how much of it you drink, and it does not matter in any case, because it will not make you drunker than your own sobriety." So this eternity is, like Alice's, strangely governable by the demands of earthly temporality, figured in the policeman's obsessive maintenance of daily readings from clock faces that purport to measure eternity's fluctuating mechanical levels. That's what they do all day. They look for bicycles and they go down into eternity and they read the clocks and the measurements, these nonsensical measurements. So it's specifically the irony of Carroll's timelessness, shot through with fluctuations of production and consumption, desire and austerity and so on, that O'Brien picks up on here. Here, the forges of eternity are refigured as factories of industry. This is a timeless eternity lined with walls, quote, "made with bolted sheets of pig iron, in which there were set rows of small doors like ovens or furnace doors or safe deposits such as banks have. Having witnessed the infernal production of, quote, a bicycle that would cost at least £8.10 to buy in one of these ovens, the narrator claims, I now found myself taking an interest in the commercial possibilities of eternity. However, he's frustrated by the fact that while the forges of this eternity can produce anything once, so he asks for, like very revealing of his personality, he asks for a solid block of gold weighing half a ton, he asks for a bottle of whiskey, he asks for a serge suit of blue with silk linings and so on. However, even though he can ask for these things and the furnace can produce them endlessly, he can have never-ending amounts of production, he can't take any of these items with him out of the eternity, because he must be the same weight going up the lift as he was going down. Realizing that his plans for wealth were, quote, vanquished and his visit to eternity unavailing and calamitous, the narrator breaks down completely and cries loudly like a baby. So again, the sense is both a repetition and an inversion of Carroll's scene of the Mad Tea Party. While the Mad Tea Party is a timeless scene where things get used up, in other words, it's a place where time has stopped, yet trickles on regardless, the eternity into which O'Brien's protagonist falls is a place wholly outside of time, which nevertheless allows for never-ending production without the possibility of consumption. As Jenica Baines puts it quite succinctly, quote, the narrator visits an eternity filled with useless commodities, obtaining things there in time that does not pass. So I'd suggest that the Third Policeman's Marxist reading of Wonderland time that, you know, Miles Nagopolin sort of jokingly refers to in his column is engaged in thinking industrialized modernity as a kind of never-ending production line, creating desires which are themselves frustrated through overabundance. Implicitly, O'Brien presents the emergent modernity of emergency-era Ireland at the outset of the Second World War as existing in a time in which time has stopped, yet trickles on regardless, in which commodities are endlessly produced without the possibility of their true consumption. Perhaps this fact offers a further insight into why the novel's original title was hell goes round and round. So for reasons that I can't go into here without spoiling some of the novel's other secrets, The Third Policeman's ending brings us back to its beginning, and it's suggested that the narrator experiences this strange modernist Irish wonderland in a never-ending loop, which he experiences as a repetition with a difference. The key image from Carroll that I wish to hold up here against this impossible circular structure of O'Brien's novel is that of the tea party's attendees, stuck in a perpetual tea time, who keep moving round the table so that both the things get used up and there's no time to wash the things between the whiles. A state of affairs which means they cannot logically or possibly respond to Alice's question. But what happens when you come to the beginning again? The unanswerable question that closes The Third Policeman, as it's about to start again in another one of its cycles, is it about a bicycle? So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Actually, I made some notes while you were going through this. So I guess if I go through some of the questions that we received, one was from Brian Sibley saying, have you or has anyone thought about the comparisons between Flann O'Brien and some of the episodes in Lewis Carroll's other books, such as Sylvie and Bruno and Sylvie and Bruno Concluded, with some of the other professors' experiments, such as relating to black light, etc.?
I mean, this is actually a great question, and it's really an untapped area. And I agree, this is something I think that somebody should do, and there's a lot of scope for it, because in the scholarship about O'Brien and Lewis Carroll up to this point, it mostly is focused on The Third Policeman for maybe obvious reasons that I have sort of outlined here. You know, perhaps, hopefully I've been relatively persuasive in showing you that there's something going on in the resonances between these books. And there's been some focus on Crushkin Lawn and Alice in Wonderland as sort of using nonsense for satirical ends. But I would say that the connection goes much deeper in both directions. So I would say that certainly like The Hunting of the Snark or Sylvie and Bruno, there's so much in all these elements. So the elements of transformation, the play with logic, punning, the play with language, the play with time. I think it's clear to me that O'Nolan read much more widely than Alice in Wonderland. And so I think that the example that those texts, there's a lot to be discovered yet in the precise connections between those texts. And one of the things that, you know, the influence of those texts on O'Brien. And one of the things that's very exciting about O'Brien studies is that he wrote so much that has only recently been started to be analyzed in detail, because he wrote, you know, millions and millions of words in his satirical column from 1940 to 1966. So it would be really interesting to look in there at the extent of his allusions to Carroll's other texts. And I've seen some suggestions of this in my own research, although it's focused on what I was talking about today. But I'd argue that it also, there's a lot of scope to look at the opposite influence, which is the influence of Carroll on O'Nolan's other works. So for example, on Béal Bucht, his Irish satire, this is a text that he wrote. It's in Irish in 1941, often neglected because of it's written in Irish in a minor language, both in terms of readership and especially criticism, but it has been translated into lots of language, including an English translation called The Poor Mouth. And that's a text in which, for example, there's a lot of human-animal transformation, right? So, you know, there's a pig who speaks Gaelic, there's a man who wraps himself in seal skins to become other, and so on. And I think there's a lot, you know, you could, for example, look at the pig baby and the pig humans in on Béal Bucht and so on. And O'Nolan's other stories, he has a short story called John Duffy's Brother, where man comes to believe that he's a train and so on. And this sort of like, you know, radical, nonsensical transformations is something that obviously extends across Carroll's writing, but also across O'Brien's writing. So it's a great question. I hope somebody does the work. I hope somebody looks into it and writes great papers and sends them to us at the Journal for Flann O'Brien Studies. And it's really rich terrain to be explored.
the train thing sounds a bit like Kafka's Metamorphosis.
Well, sure, there's a very common element of metamorphosis across these texts, which, but I think where Nolan's or O'Brien's, whatever you want to call them, metamorphosis is even closer to Carroll is in their comic quality, you know, in their sort of like nonsensical comic drive, which makes them more, in some ways, more Carrollian than Kafkaesque. Although people have obviously argued for Kafka and Ovid and everybody else.
It's quite, and my own observation, I mean, because I've been scribbling notes down here, one of the observations is that, yeah, I mean, they were both interested in time, physics, you know, non-typical ideas that were displayed, if you like, I'll call it a pastoral setting. And so lots of the people who are interested in them, I mean, the example I can give you is people like Alan Turing and the people at Bletchley Park at all of those times, cryptographers, they were really into it. And I can remember, I won't get this exactly right, but one of the quiz questions when you were joining as a cryptographer, and I can't remember, my wife remembers the name of the guy, Dilly Knox, his name was. So you'd have a quiz. So one of the quizzes questions was, what direction does a clock's hand go around in?
Okay.
So the answer would
the answer is
clockwise, and then he would say, "But what if you're the clock?"
No.
And it's such a simple idea that all of a sudden your ideas of time have, you know, changed the clock.
But this is also why they're both very interesting for like contemporary debates in, you know, criticism and so on, because at the moment there's a very large turn towards what's called non-human studies. So this idea of like decentering the human and rethinking events through animal mechanical perspectives, through objects and so on and so forth. And, you know, for example, Jacques Derrida, who wrote a very pioneering text about this, uses Alice in Wonderland is this sort of primary example of decentering the human perspective, the gaze of the animal, you know, how these limits between the human and the animal become blurred and so on. And what I would say is both, you know, this idea of centering the clock, you know, is something that we see in Carroll, it's like very Carrollian immediately to us, but also very O'Brienian, you know, if that's the term, in his sort of idea of like people becoming bicycles, people becoming trains, what's it like to be an object? What's it like to be an animal? You know, this sort of, they're very common in this. And your other point about the sort of more general zeitgeist of like moving from Euclidean time to sort of, you know, relativity and the new physics and so on. Yeah, I mean, I think this is really the case. Of course, both Carroll and O'Brien are writing at sort of either ends of this long transformation of scientific ideas of time.
Industrial revolution. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, even yes, right, but even, you know, the relativity of time and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And they, you know, they sort of bookend that very nicely. You know, Carroll in the mid-19th century, O'Brien in the mid-20th century. O'Brien is sort of just at the very end of the debates where people would still like see printed in a newspaper columns about the debates between Bergson and Einstein about the nature of time and things like this. This sort of historicized now a little bit, but yeah, they bookend this sort of this larger debate and zeitgeist very nicely as well, I think, for people who are interested in that.
And the other observation is that when you were talking about the Marxist aspect of it, I know I've shared something with you where Ralph Steadman did illustrations for Flann O'Brien, and you know, and he did a version for Alice in Wonderland. And in the Alice in Wonderland one, he made the cards, instead of being playing cards, he made them union cards.
It's fabulous. I should, if I'd known about this, I would have put it on my slide for this part.
You can save it for later, you know. But he did, you know, I mean, he did, yeah. I mean,
but I'm really intrigued by this because Steadman is obviously one of the great illustrators of, you know, the last 50 years, from, you know, Hunter S. Thompson, but he illustrated the Poor Mouth on Bell Book, the Flann O'Brien books. He illustrated Carroll as well, as you say. Incredible. It's really fascinating that he seems to make a sort of similar observation or a similar gag or a similar sort of has a similar sort of insight as O'Brien. It shows that they have. It's not surprising to me that Stedman illustrates both of them in this way.
And he does talk about it. I mean, and he makes the White Rabbit into a modern commuter. So it's all to do with time, use of time. It's it's quite interesting.
Yeah, and this is also very appropriate in all the ways in which the White Rabbit is generally read as like this kind of time-stressed Victorian, right? He's always late. He's under the crush of the clock. He's looking at his, and at the very start, Alice isn't even fazed by the talking rabbit. It's that he produces a wristwatch, which is what's so remarkable to her. So from the outset, and she's lazing around. She's trying to decide whether or not to exert the effort to make a daisy chain. Even at the outset, you have this idea of timeless, wasting time and the stress of time. This is what pushes her down the rabbit hole. The idea of him as a commuter, I think, is very updated, but also very resonant with the original text.
And I think because I was trying to read up a bit before, the other thing that I think is that some of the language, I mean, that thing about the commercial possibilities of eternity sounds straight out of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I'd expect that from Zaphod Beeblebrox or someone.
Yeah, I mean, like, I haven't sat down and figured this out, but I think people have observed there's some kind of genealogy here, right? There's some kind of tradition with like Carroll and Flann O'Brien, and which maybe extends then to like Spike Milligan and Douglas Adams and people like this. So yeah, I see a similar mindset in Adams as well. I think that's a good observation. Yeah, and also how Adams takes these genres that he's playing with and makes them about administrative problems of like the modernity. Like this is also very Carroll and O'Brien, or especially O'Brien.
It's very Flann O'Brien, Third Policeman, where it's the administrative problems with the eternity and hereafter. Some comments from Joseph Brooker. He's just made a comment that it's a good a brilliant Miles touch with the time factor becoming a character in the Kruskeen Lawn sketch.
Sorry, what was Joe's comment that about the time factor becoming a character in Kruskeen Lawn?
In the Kruskeen Lawn sketch, it's a brilliant Miles touch. With it
it's a great Miles touch, but I think I mean I'm 100% convinced that it's a Lewis Carroll reference. I mean, to me, it's evident that it's a nod to the time, to the labouring time from the Mad Tea Party, but it is great Miles touch. You remind me of one of my when you talk about the administrative qualities of timelessness that's sort of so key to O'Brien. Remind me of one of my favourite Kruskeen Lawn columns, which is where he's reporting about his father, Sir Miles, who has recently died, and then Sir Miles comes back to life, and he has like this press conference, and everybody's interviewing him about being dead, and he says, you wouldn't believe the paperwork, the administrative thing. I am not, I'm not able to, I'm not executor to my own estate after my wife's hasty nuptials to my brother, and basically just goes through all these administrative chores of like coming back to life, and he finishes by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, I would rather be dead." And it's just a beautiful O'Brien joke in this administrative quality of the afterlife. There's actually a great book written about this by Ruben Borg, a colleague of mine, called Fantasies of Self-Mourning, and he has a chapter in that about posthumous administrativeness in like Virginia Woolf and in Flann O'Brien, Beckett. It's a great book if you recommend.
Someone made a point that Hitchhiker's Guide radio from Camus to everyone. Hitchhiker's Guide radio scripts were first entitled Fit the First, Fit the Second, which was a clear link to Lewis Carroll.
Oh, wow, and, interesting.
Yeah, we did have someone who actually gave a talk year before last, and about potential links between Hitchhiker's Guide and Lewis Carroll.
I'd be really fascinated to see that. I mean, I'm a fan of Adams, but I'm not a researcher of his, so I'm not aware of this. But I would love to read more about this.
Me and Jane can find it. It'll be in addition of the Carrollian or somewhere. And Joseph Brooker makes a point as well about how Adams is into administration and corporate life. The idea of personification, the idea, becoming a person.
Yeah, and yes, and this is something a quality I didn't get to capture in my quotes from the book, but the policemen speak in this really, really like excessively banal, cliched administrative language. You know, every sentence is paragraph, and they, you know, it's this real like loopholes and loopholes kind of administrative talk, which of course O'Brien would have been very familiar with in his career as a civil servant. So one feels that his day job is influencing him in these representations of these like administrators.
I think that was the same with Carroll as well. You know, yes. Working at a university, seeing the eccentric people, strange behaviours. You know, you just put it down on paper, throw in a few animals, a few songs, poems, pish posh. You go, bestseller, 150 a year.
Money for old rope.
But I'll tell you, if Sarah can unmute everyone, they can, you know, they can ask questions. I mean, because there's a few of them saying it sounds like Gogol as well. I mean, Joseph Brooke has got a few